12 Golden Age actors who were shockingly short. They were the towering titans of Hollywood's Golden Age, commanding the screen with charisma so grand it made them feel like giants. But behind the silver screen magic, a surprising truth stood just a few inches tall. Many of cinema's most imposing legends were, in reality, shockingly short. In this video, we pull back the velvet curtain to reveal 12 Golden Age actors who relied on apple boxes, camera tricks, and even specially dug trenches to stand shoulder to shoulder with their co-stars. From rugged tough guys balanced on hidden platforms to swoon-worthy romantic leads who were actually shorter than their leading ladies, these stars' greatest performance might have been selling the illusion of height itself. This wasn't just an occasional trick of the lens, it was a full-scale Hollywood operation. Set designers built false floors. Wardrobe departments crafted discreet elevator shoes. Directors perfected low-angle shots to stretch reality. Casting agents even paired leading men with shorter actresses to maintain the fantasy. In an era when masculinity was measured in inches, being below average height could mean the difference between stardom and obscurity. So, studios guarded their actors' true measurements like state secrets. The audience saw towering heroes. The truth. A masterclass in illusion. By the time we reach the end of this countdown, you'll see just how far Tinseltown went to turn modest men into towering legends, and why height might have been the Golden Age's most closely guarded lie. Who are you, stranger? I'm a friend of the stars. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd, the original box office tough guy with the kind of presence you couldn't measure in inches. With those piercing eyes and a cool, tight-lipped intensity, he lit up the screen in classics like This Gun for Hire and Shane. But here's the twist. Hollywood's formidable leading man stood no taller than 5 feet 6 inches, and some say he was even shorter. Paramount Studios knew they had a star, but they also had a problem. So, they built an entire playbook to make Ladd look taller. The easiest fix? Pair him with a petite Veronica Lake, just 4 feet 11 inches, whose height made him seem statuesque without a single camera trick. It was more than chemistry, it was strategy. When the co-stars weren't pint-sized, the tactics got creative. On Shane, director George Stevens famously had trenches dug for actors like Jack Palance and Van Heflin to stand in, Ladd trenches, they were called. In other scenes, he'd be elevated on hidden platforms or Ladd boxes. Cinematographers framed him from low angles, while costume designers stretched his silhouette with vertical pinstripes, high-waisted trousers, and custom-built shoe lifts that added 2 or 3 extra inches. But here's where it gets fascinating. Those physical limitations may have shaped his legendary acting style. Ladd kept his movements minimal, letting his eyes do the heavy lifting, because any wide gesture could shatter the carefully crafted illusion. As director Gene Negulesco once said, what Alan lacked in height, he made up for in intensity. The camera didn't see his height, it saw his eyes. James Cagney. James Cagney, the compact powerhouse who towered without height. For decades, Cagney's explosive presence and tough guy snarl ruled the silver screen in classics from The Public Enemy to White Heat. Yet behind that larger-than-life image was a man who stood just 5 feet 5 inches in reality. Unlike other actors who fretted over their stature, Cagney dismissed the insecurity with a shrug. I don't care how tall I am or how short I am, he once said. I care about whether I can act. Warner Brothers certainly cared, at least enough to master the art of making their star look 10 feet tall. Casting him alongside actors of similar or shorter height became standard. When taller co-stars were unavoidable, directors turned to clever staging, seating Cagney while others stood, placing him on stairs during tense showdowns, or using blocking that subtly minimized direct comparisons. Cinematographers even developed what insiders called the Cagney angle, a slightly low camera position that gave him a visual boost without the audience catching on. Director Michael Curtiz perfected the trick, framing Cagney so that he filled the screen with authority. But the real magic wasn't in the tricks. It was in Cagney himself. He moved with the coiled energy of a spring, his rapid gestures, darting footwork, and volcanic bursts of emotion commanding every frame. Film historian David Thompson put it best, Cagney moved like a coiled spring. His energy made him seem larger than life regardless of his actual height. Publicists happily fed the illusion, listing him at 5 feet 9 inches in official bios, a generous 4 inches taller than the truth. Cagney laughed about it in later years. People expect me to be much bigger in person. I suppose that's a compliment, to my acting, or maybe to the cameraman and the fellows who build the sets. In the end, it wasn't his height that made him a giant. It was the way he filled the screen, leaving audiences convinced they were watching a man twice his size. Edward G. Robinson, the giant behind Little Caesar. Edward G. Robinson carved his name into Hollywood history by bringing some of cinema's most intimidating figures to life. From the cold-blooded gangster Rico in Little Caesar to the unyielding investigator in Double Indemnity, Robinson radiated a commanding force on screen. Which is why audiences were always stunned to learn, off-camera, he stood just 5 feet 5 inches. It wasn't just clever camera angles that disguised his stature. Robinson and the visionary directors who worked with him, legends like Mervyn Leroy and Fritz Lang, redefined how menace could be portrayed. Instead of relying on physical size, they built psychological dominance. Through strategic blocking, Robinson was often framed in positions of absolute power, seated behind a desk while taller men stood before him, or leaning into another actor's space just enough to trigger discomfort and tension. And then there was the voice. That sharp, clipped delivery. The forceful, slightly nasal tone that could cut through any room. Director John Huston once said, Eddie didn't need to be tall, he had a voice that made him 10 feet high. Warner Brothers worked hard to maintain the illusion, even inflating his official biography to list him at 5 feet 9 inches and carefully arranging interviews so most reporters only saw him seated. But what's truly remarkable is that Robinson's height may have made him more believable as a gangster. As critic Roger Ebert later observed, his characters carried an edge of scrappy defiance, a man who had to be twice as cunning, twice as ruthless, just to survive in a world of bigger men. Okay, shake the hand that's gonna milk 90 cows, kid. Next case. Good night, gentlemen. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney, Hollywood's biggest little star. Standing just 5'2", Mickey Rooney was one of the shortest leading men in Hollywood history, but his talent towered over the industry. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, he wasn't just a star. He was MGM's biggest box office draw. Audiences adored him in the beloved Andy Hardy series and in dazzling musicals alongside Judy Garland. Unlike other short actors who fought to hide their height, Rooney's early career turned it into an asset. MGM marketed him as the eternal boy next door, playing wholesome teenagers well into his 20s. The Andy Hardy films made his size part of his charm, proof that charisma, not inches, wins hearts. But as he aged into more adult roles, the challenge grew. MGM's crew became masters of illusion, crafting custom shoes with 3-inch lifts, using clever camera angles, even raising Rooney on hidden platforms. Cinematographer Harold Rosson found ways to stretch his shadow across walls, subtly giving the impression of extra height. Costume designers avoided horizontal patterns and dressed him in slimming vertical lines to elongate his frame. And when the youth star chapter closed, Rooney adapted again. He leaned into his stature for comedic effect, especially when paired with statuesque leading ladies. It wasn't self-deprecation, it was self-awareness. And it kept his career alive for decades. Through it all, Rooney never let his height define him. "I'm not a tall man," he once said, "but I stand among giants in this business." Director Clarence Brown, who worked with him on National Velvet, put it best, "The camera doesn't measure inches, it measures presence." And Mickey had more talent in his 5 feet 2 inches frame than most actors twice his size. That presence, fierce, magnetic, unforgettable, made Mickey Rooney not just a survivor in Hollywood, but one of its most enduring legends. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart, the not-so-tall, dark stranger. He may have been the face of Hollywood's toughest, most world-weary heroes, but in real life, Bogart wasn't nearly as towering as his screen image suggested. The star of Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon wasn't the 5 feet 10 inches leading man Warner Brothers claimed in publicity materials. His real height was closer to 5 feet 8 inches, with some insisting he stood no taller than 5 feet 6 inches. In the early days of his career, when Bogart was stuck playing supporting roles and sneering villains, the studio barely bothered to hide his stature. But everything changed once High Sierra and the Maltese Falcon turned him into a bona fide leading man. Suddenly, Warner Brothers pulled out every trick in the book. Enter the famous Bogey Box, a portable platform he would stand on when filming with taller co-stars. During Casablanca, it became a necessity. Ingrid Bergman stood a striking 5 feet 9 inches, and director Michael Curtiz was determined to make them look perfectly matched. Scenes were blocked so Bogart was on steps, Bergman was seated, or camera angles were tilted just so. Cinematographer Arthur Eade's son used low shots, dramatic lighting, and elongated shadows to give Bogart an imposing silhouette. Costume designer Ori Kelly added vertical pinstripes and high waistlines to stretch him visually. And Bogart himself leaned into the illusion. His trademark head tilt and slightly hunched posture, often mistaken for part of his tough guy swagger, also helped mask height differences when standing beside taller actors. Ironically, his so-called limitations may have shaped his legendary style. Bogart's performances were spare and deliberate. Minimal movement, maximum presence. He let his eyes, his voice, and his silences do the heavy lifting, which only strengthened the illusion of a man who commanded every room he entered. Warner Brothers guarded this image fiercely. Publicity photos were staged with precision, and public appearances were choreographed so no one could catch the real measurement. As director John Huston, who worked with him on some of his greatest films, once said, "Bogey's size didn't matter. When he walked into a room on screen, you felt it before you saw him. That kind of presence can't be measured in inches." Dustin Hoffman, from The Graduate to mastering the height illusion. Though Dustin Hoffman arrived after Hollywood's golden age, his career forms a fascinating bridge between old-school tricks and modern storytelling. Standing just 5 feet 6 inches, Hoffman faced the same challenges as earlier shorter leading men, but instead of hiding his stature, he often wove it into the very fabric of his characters. His breakout in The Graduate, 1967, set the tone for decades to come. Director Mike Nichols used classic techniques, platforms, careful camera angles, to subtly boost Hoffman's presence. But he also turned the height difference between Hoffman and Bancroft into a psychological weapon. The smaller, younger man caught in the gravitational pull of a confident, statuesque older woman. From there, Hoffman's height became part of his cinematic signature. In Midnight Cowboy and Kramer vs. Kramer, his stature subtly reinforced his underdog status, a man battling forces bigger than himself, both literally and figuratively. Rather than erasing the reality, Hoffman and his directors leaned into it, making it an element of character rather than a flaw to be disguised. The industry's methods evolved with him. Platform shoes, often giving him an extra 2 or 3 inches, were still in the mix, but cinematographers traded the obvious low-angle shots of earlier decades for more refined, invisible tricks. Costume designers tailored his look with vertical lines and proportion-enhancing cuts, avoiding anything that might emphasize his smaller frame. In Tootsie, Hoffman's height became an unexpected asset, helping sell the illusion of his female alter ego. Unlike the studio era, when publicity teams shamelessly inflated actors' heights, Hoffman's press materials often sidestepped the topic entirely. And when he did address it, it was with disarming honesty. "I think I was lucky being short," he once said. "It forced me to develop other qualities and be specific about the kinds of roles I pursued. I was never going to be the conventional leading man, so I had to find my own path." Director Sidney Pollack, who guided him through Tootsie, summed it up perfectly. "Dustin doesn't try to be something he's not physically. He makes you forget about height by being so compelling in every other way." In a business built on illusion, Hoffman's greatest trick wasn't adding inches, it was making them irrelevant. Danny Kaye. Danny Kaye was comedy in motion. With his lightning-fast wit, rubber-faced expressions, and musical brilliance, he became one of Hollywood's most beloved entertainers of the 1940s and 50s. In classics like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty and The Court Jester, Kaye's energy filled the screen so completely that most audiences never noticed he stood just 5 feet 7 inches, shorter than many of his leading ladies and co-stars. While dramatic actors often relied on elaborate tricks to seem taller, Kaye's height illusion came naturally. He was a whirlwind, dancing, gesturing, leaping, and contorting with such constant movement that viewers had no time to register the difference. This perpetual motion became his trademark, turning what could have been a disadvantage into pure magic. Still, Samuel Goldwyn Studios wasn't above using a few old Hollywood tricks for romantic scenes. Raised platforms, clever camera angles, and strategic blocking all helped create the image of a traditional leading man. But Kaye's physical proportions were actually perfect for what he did best. His compact frame and flawless coordination let him pull off intricate dance numbers and physical comedy routines that taller, less agile actors couldn't dream of matching. Legendary costume designer Edith Head knew exactly how to dress him. Vertical lines, sharp tailoring, and silhouettes that subtly elongated his frame while showing off his lean build. And unlike many actors sensitive about their height, Kaye embraced it with the same humor that defined his career. Filming White Christmas alongside the towering 6 feet 3 inches Bing Crosby, he joked to the crew, "Between the two of us, we average out to the perfect height. Bing's got the surplus, I've got the shortage. Sometimes, he even played his height for laughs, letting the contrast with taller co-stars become part of the gag. Director Norman Z. MacLeod, who worked with Kaye on Walter Mitty, summed it up best: Danny's energy makes you forget about physical dimensions. When he's performing, he grows beyond his size. He's exactly as big as his talent, and that's enormous. George Raft, Hollywood's compact king of cool. In the golden age of gangster films, no one radiated danger quite like George Raft. With his slick hair, razor-sharp suits, and an expression that could freeze a man in his tracks, Raft became one of the definitive tough guys of the 1930s and 40s. But behind that aura of menace was a surprising detail. The screen's most feared mobster stood just 5 feet 7 inches. Raft's secret weapon wasn't size, it was style. A former professional dancer, he carried himself with a grace and precision that made every movement count. On screen, he often stood perfectly still, letting a slow flicker of emotion cross his face. That wasn't just acting, it was strategy. Stillness kept the height tricks intact. Carefully framed shots, subtle camera angles from below, and costumes with vertical pinstripes and high-waisted trousers that stretched his silhouette. Even his shoes were discreetly fitted with lifts for an extra 2 inches. Warner Brothers took no chances. They paired him with shorter leading ladies, avoided towering male co-stars, and, when they couldn't, used raised platforms and clever blocking to keep Raft looking formidable. Publicity materials even adjusted reality, often claiming he was 5 feet 10 inches or even 6 feet tall, while studio photographers mastered angles that made him seem to tower in stills. But Raft didn't brood over his height. Unlike other stars who obsessed over such details, he owned it. Director Raoul Walsh remembered, George knew exactly what he was and wasn't. He didn't waste energy on what he couldn't change. He focused on making the most of what he had. And what he had was lethal charisma. His compact, athletic build gave him a coiled, ready-to-strike energy. As film historian Eddie Muller once said, Raft didn't need to loom over you to scare you. Those dead eyes and that stillness made him more dangerous than bigger men who relied on size for intimidation. Critic Andrew Sarris put it best, Raft's gangsters didn't need height to dominate. They had something far more frightening: absolute confidence, and the unshakable belief that no matter the odds, they'd win. Sal Mineo. Sal Mineo, the compact rebel. In the golden haze of 1950s Hollywood, Sal Mineo stood out, not because of his height, but because of the raw, aching vulnerability he brought to the screen. At just 5 feet 6 inches, he was hardly the towering figure studios preferred for their leading men, yet his performance opposite James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause earned him an Oscar nomination and cemented him as one of the era's most magnetic supporting actors. What audiences never knew was that his height, often considered a handicap in Hollywood, was, in his early career, an advantage. Playing troubled, misunderstood teens, Mineo's smaller frame amplified his character's fragility, their sense of being out of place in a dangerous, adult world. Director Nicholas Ray even used this to brilliant effect in Rebel Without a Cause, framing Mineo against Dean so that every glance, every gesture seemed to plead for protection. But as Sal grew older and began reaching for more mature roles, the industry's obsession with physical stature became harder to ignore. Studios quietly pulled every trick in the book: elevator shoes, low camera angles, careful blocking to avoid direct comparisons with taller co-stars. Costume designers lengthened his silhouette with impeccable tailoring and vertical lines, while his now iconic pompadour hairstyle added a few strategic inches to his look. Unlike many actors, Sal didn't fight to hide his stature in every role. When a part called for boyish vulnerability, he let his size work for him. This wasn't insecurity, it was craft. Still, the shift from teenage rebel to adult leading man proved a steep climb. Hollywood's narrow definition of masculinity meant that Mineo, despite his immense talent, was often boxed into certain roles. Director Don Siegel, who worked with him on Crime in the Streets, once remarked, "Sal had more talent in his small frame than most actors twice his size." It's a tragedy that Hollywood couldn't see past that. His words cut to the truth. In an industry obsessed with inches, extraordinary ability was sometimes overshadowed by something as arbitrary as a tape measure. Mineo's story is a reminder that countless gifted actors may have been sidelined, not for lack of talent, but because they didn't fit the mold. And in Sal's case, the rebel spirit that lit up the screen could never be measured in feet and inches. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was proof that greatness isn't measured in inches. Singer, dancer, actor, comedian. He was a one-man whirlwind of talent, a performer so dynamic that audiences often forgot he stood just 5 feet 3 inches. In fact, he was one of the shortest leading men in Hollywood history. But rather than let that hold him back, Davis turned every so-called limitation into fuel. As a black entertainer navigating both racial prejudice and the scrutiny of his stature, Sammy refused to be defined by either. Instead, he became a master of everything, singing with a voice that could melt steel, dancing with such electricity that you couldn't take your eyes off him, delivering comedy so sharp it could slice through tension, and acting with a kind of presence that filled every inch of the screen. While many actors relied on camera tricks to disguise their height, Sammy's performances made you forget about it entirely. His explosive footwork, animated expressions, and commanding energy pulled your focus to the magic he was creating, not the inches he lacked. Still, for film work, he played the game. Custom elevator shoes gave him an extra 2 or 3 inches, and his signature high pompadour added a little more. Directors used low angles, clever staging, and raised platforms when scenes called for him to stand eye to eye with taller co-stars. Even among his Rat Pack brothers, Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, Sammy never let the height gap become a weak point. Their staging, choreography, and timing kept him in constant motion, drawing eyes to his artistry rather than physical comparisons. And when the topic did come up, he handled it with wit. Once, after Dean Martin teased him on stage, Sammy shot back, "I may be looking up at you physically, but musically, you're looking up at me." The crowd roared, because it was true. He often summed up his philosophy in one unforgettable line: "Being a short, one-eyed black man in show business meant I had to be 10 times better than everyone else just to get half the recognition. So that's what I became, 10 times better." And he was. Frank Sinatra put it best: "Sammy may be short in inches, but he's a giant in talent. When he's on stage, you forget about everything except the magic happening in front of you." Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith, the mighty might. Few actors ever mastered versatility the way Burgess Meredith did. With a career spanning decades, he became one of Hollywood's most respected character actors, slipping effortlessly from one unforgettable role to the next. He was the fiery, gravel-voiced Mickey in the Rocky series, a boxing trainer whose every word felt like a punch to the gut, and the cunning, cackling penguin in the 1960s Batman television show, a villain who was as magnetic as he was menacing. Yet behind these larger-than-life portrayals stood a man just 5 feet 5 inches tall. In an industry that often worshipped towering leading men, Meredith's height might have been a challenge, but he turned it into a secret weapon. As a character actor, he had the freedom to let his stature serve the role. In Rocky, directors played up his smaller frame, making Mickey's underdog grit feel even more authentic. But when a role demanded authority, a military officer, a political leader, the magic of Hollywood stepped in. Elevator shoes, raised platforms, and carefully chosen camera angles transformed him into a commanding figure. What truly made his height irrelevant, though, was his voice. Rich, resonant, and cutting through the air like a blade, it could fill any room and dominate any scene. Director John Huston once remarked, "Burgess doesn't need height. His voice alone commands the room." Meredith also understood the power of movement. Every gesture was deliberate. Every stance was perfect. His posture and precision gave him a presence far greater than his frame. Unlike shorter actors who tried to overcompensate with loud or exaggerated performances, Meredith relied on control, subtlety, and a master craftsman's touch. He rarely spoke about his height, preferring to focus on the art of acting. If pressed, he would simply say, "An actor's job is to convince the audience of whatever the role demands. If you believe I'm a commander or a champion, then my size doesn't matter." And audiences did believe. Always. As critic Pauline Kaye once observed, Burgess Meredith may be small in stature, but he's incapable of giving a small performance. Even in his quietest moments, he was unshakable, a presence you could feel as much as see. "Saturday night is the loneliest night of the week," he once said, and in that voice, even loneliness sounded unforgettable. Frank Sinatra, the voice that rose above height. Frank Sinatra's name alone evokes an image, a man whose voice could melt stone, whose presence could command any room, and whose eyes, cool as ocean water, seemed to see right through you. He was one of the most magnetic entertainers of the 20th century, a legend on stage and screen. But what many fans never realized was that OL blue eyes stood just 5 feet 7 inches, perhaps a hair less. In Hollywood, Where leading men were expected to tower over their co-stars, this was a detail the studios worked hard to keep in the shadows. Sinatra's case was unique. Before audiences ever saw him in person, they heard him. That rich, commanding voice created an image in the public's mind, a man as physically imposing as his sound. It was a perception that worked in his favor when he transitioned from music into movies, especially after his Oscar-winning turn in From Here to Eternity. Still, Hollywood was determined to make sure Frank looked the part of a towering leading man. Behind the scenes, a quiet magic act was in play. Sinatra often wore custom-made elevator shoes, adding 2 to 3 inches to his frame. Cinematographers used low camera angles to give him a more commanding silhouette. Directors staged scenes so that when he acted opposite tall leading ladies like Doris Day or Deborah Kerr, both 5 feet 7 inches, they would be seated, barefoot, or positioned just a step lower than Frank. With taller male co-stars, similar tricks were deployed: careful blocking, strategic set design, and camera placement that disguised any difference. But Sinatra's true height didn't matter once he stepped onto a set. Director Sidney J. Furie, who worked with him on The Naked Runner, put it best. Frank had something far more important than physical height. He had presence. When he walked onto a set, everyone felt it. The camera captures that kind of authentic power in a way that makes actual inches irrelevant. Sinatra's story is part of a bigger Hollywood tradition, the great height illusion of leading men. From Alan Ladd's hidden trenches to Humphrey Bogart's concealed platforms to James Cagney's fiery, kinetic energy, the industry perfected an art form dedicated to making male stars look taller. This obsession was not applied equally. Women were already expected to be shorter, even as they faced an entirely different set of physical demands from weight to facial symmetry to bust measurements. For many shorter male actors, compensating for stature shaped their entire performance style. Cagney exploded with physical energy, Bogart radiated quiet intensity, Edward G. Robinson mastered psychological intimidation. These weren't just creative choices, they were survival tools that became signature traits. The success of these illusions speaks to the power of old Hollywood's machinery. In the pre-internet era, audiences rarely questioned what they saw on screen. Lighting, blocking, and camera work didn't just hide the truth, they created a fantasy. A fantasy so convincing that millions believed it without hesitation. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. In Hollywood, physical standards have never been fixed, they've been manufactured, stage-managed, and sold as reality. In an industry built on illusion, height was just another trick of the trade. And Frank Sinatra proved you didn't need to be tall to stand head and shoulders above the rest. These 12 actors proved that greatness on screen isn't measured in inches, it's measured in impact. Each of them rose above so-called height limitations to carve out legendary careers, reminding us of James Cagney's timeless words, "It's not how tall you stand, it's how tall you stand in people's hearts." These were the true, diminutive giants of Hollywood. Men whose cultural stature towered far beyond what any tape measure could capture. Whether standing on apple boxes, platforms, or hidden trenches, they commanded the silver screen with a presence that could fill an entire theater. From Humphrey Bogart's quiet, smoldering intensity to James Cagney's crackling energy, from Alan Ladd's steely, unforgettable gaze to Frank Sinatra's magnetic, almost hypnotic charm, these stars left behind performances that still burn bright decades later. What makes their stories so captivating isn't just the clever camera tricks, it's how they transformed what could have been a limitation into a signature strength. They didn't just work around their height, they used it, shaping unique performance styles that became part of their enduring legend. So, did any of these revelations catch you off guard? Have you ever spotted the subtle hints of Hollywood's height illusions in your favorite classics? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know which star surprised you the most. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden history, give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and stay tuned. There are plenty more secrets from classic cinema waiting to be uncovered.